Welcome everybody back to another episode of Makdisi Street podcast. As usual, I'm joined by my brothers Sari
Hello, everyone.
and Usman.
Hey everyone, nice to be here.
And today, actually, we're quite thrilled to have with us the kind of renowned investigative reporter Jeremy Scahill, who was kind enough to join us. I'm going to just briefly introduce him, but I think our audience probably knows him very well. He's a senior correspondent and editor at large at the Intercept. And in fact, he was a co-editor and co-founder of the Intercept and co-hosts the Intercepted podcast, which is extremely popular. And of course, if anybody doesn't know that and doesn't subscribe to it, I highly recommend that you do so immediately. Jeremy has been reporting from all over the world, including Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Yemen, Nigeria. I was very happy and lucky to meet Jeremy here in Lebanon quite some years ago when he was showing his excellent film on Yemen, and he has his books, Dirty Wars, The World is a Battlefield, and Blackwater, The Rise of the World's Most Powerful Mercenary Army. Jeremy has won all sorts of awards for his journalism, his books, and his films. And we're really, very, very happy to have him here to discuss, some very important topics, including trying to figure out now we're over 110 days of this war in Gaza. There's the question of the Biden administration, the U.S. administration, and its dealings with the Middle East in general. And since Jeremy has been an investigative reporter for so long, over the past couple of decades, I would be very happy if, Jeremy, you could just start off, just talking a little bit about how you see your own career evolving in terms of, in particular, in terms of how you've been reporting to the Middle East and how this might have evolved over the past 10 or 20 years.
Well, first of all, it's really an honor to be on Makdisi Street. I have to say I'm a little bit intimidated, when you're a kind of ragamuffin journalist and then you sit down, with three learned intellectuals, academics, and then you sort of wonder what can you offer. It's a humbling experience, but it's really it's my honor to be here with all of you. And Karim, also recently you were a guest on our show Intercepted, and with Amal Saad, the great Hezbollah and Axis of Resistance scholar. And it was a very popular episode. We had an enormous number of downloads. I think people are really thirsty right now for information that digs beyond the superficial layer. And, that's part of what we try to do in our coverage also at the Intercept. I started as a foreign correspondent or, war reporter of sorts, kind of by accident. I started listening to a radio journalist in the US in the 1990s. I was working in a homeless shelter at the time first I was in Washington, D.C., and then I was in New York, and I listened to a lot of talk radio. And I heard this woman on the radio confronting then Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, when the Republican Revolution came to power in the United States. And it was the most tenacious questioning I'd ever heard of a public official. And the journalist doing the questioning was a woman named Amy Goodman, who at the time was the host of a brand new show called Democracy Now! And I won't bore you with all the details, but I'll just say that I engaged in a relentless campaign of not creepy stalking of Amy Goodman, begging her to give me any sort of work. I would write her actual old-fashioned letters and mail them with a stamp on an envelope, saying, I want to do what you do. And she ignored me for a very long time, but I was persistent, and eventually she agreed to allow me to come in and start volunteering on her radio show. And at first, what I was doing was just clipping news articles for her to write the news headlines. And it was one of the greatest jobs I ever had. I would get up really early in the morning. I'd go up to Times Square and I would buy every single newspaper, newspapers from all over the world too. We went to one specific stand that sold them. And my job was to sit in the smoking lounge at this crusty radio station and read every paper and try to not just find this was before the internet was the internet, but to try to find the story behind the story and to learn how to critically read corporate big news outlets like the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Guardian or the Independent or Le Monde, and then to distill it into somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes of news headlines. And so I had this kind of almost I learned journalism almost the way that like a plumber or a carpenter or an electrician learns their trade. This wasn't a course of academic pursuit for me. I didn't view it as a career. It was something where I heard someone doing something that I thought was so extraordinary, not just confronting the powerful, but also interviewing people. I remember so clearly when rebels were fighting to overthrow the US-backed dictatorship of Mobutu Sese Seko, in Congo, and Amy Goodman was interviewing some of the rebel leaders by radio as they were engaged in this, campaign. She survived a massacre of more than 200 people in East Timor, where they were gunned down by Indonesian soldiers wielding U.S. Automatic rifles. So yeah, I wanted to do that. I didn't know exactly how to do it, and I just poured myself into it like an apprentice. And the first trip that I took as a reporter internationally was to Iraq in the 1990s when Saddam Hussein was in power and when Bill Clinton, a popular Democratic president, was presiding over the longest sustained U.S. bombing campaign since Vietnam under the guise of the so-called no-fly zones in Iraq that on paper were about protecting the Shia population in southern Iraq and the Kurdish population in northern Iraq. But in reality, it was a campaign of terror that was aimed at trying to force the Iraqi civilians by starving them, depriving them of medicine, and then keeping this low intensity regular bombing campaign going to try to sort of strangle them into submission or to overthrow Saddam's government. And a lot of what I did as a reporter in those early days was just go to Iraqi hospitals. And I would tell the stories of individual people that I met in the hospitals and how the sanctions imposed by my government affected their lives. I also traveled to the no-fly zones when they were being heavily bombarded and interviewed Shia families whose loved ones had been killed, supposedly in pursuit of defending them. And I think that when you cut your teeth as a journalist or you come of age as a journalist during a Democratic administration, when you're an American, and you really go to the other side of the barrel of the gun of American foreign policy, and you meet people that you're told are the enemy, or you meet people that you're told your government is protecting who completely reject that fallacy. In some ways, it instills in you, I think, a much stronger sense of the power of the American empire than if villains like Donald Trump are in power when you become a journalist, or really gangster empire politicians like Bush and Cheney are in power. I came of age watching Bill Clinton operate an extraordinarily belligerent executive branch of the United States government, and to do it in the name of what Chomsky at the time called the sort of new military humanism. And really that experience in Iraq of going to these hospitals that I would say amounted to death rows for infants because of American policy, I think it really started a fire in my heart that made me want to dedicate myself to telling the stories of those people who lived on the other side of our policy. And that took me to investigating the Blackwater Mercenary Company and the killing of civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan as they served as the Praetorian Guard, the privatized Praetorian Guard of the Bush-Cheney global wars. When Obama was elected and immediately started, at the beginning, it was a covert air war in Yemen. It began in December of 2009. And then you had the expansion of American drone strikes, the regular hitting of villages and weddings and funerals in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And so I started to kind of trace the tapestry of this emerging new warfare that Obama was engaged in as a claim to be smarter and more effective than large military presence on the ground that had marked the Bush-Cheney era. And so a lot of what I was doing I always say that journalism is it's a working person's job. Your fingernails have to get dirty doing it. You have to be out there with the people. You can't just sit at a desk or cruise the internet. You have to actually go there and feel it and smell it and be among ordinary people. That's often where the real stories are. And so we certainly see that in Gaza today, where the most vital and gut-wrenching reporting that is happening is Palestinian journalists, many of whom are unfamous journalists or don't necessarily even have a big outlet that they're reporting for, but they are the eyes and ears and voice of the world right now. And so many of them have been killed in what appears to be a systematic campaign. And it's shameful how many of my American colleagues stand silent as their Palestinian colleagues are assassinated, and not just the journalists and the media workers, but their family members too. So, I come to journalism trying to tell stories from the bottom up. I don't cozy up to the powerful. I believe in being among the people and telling their stories while also investigating the powerful that are trying to ruin their lives in the name of peace, freedom, and democracy.
Thanks, Jeremy. That's amazing. I wanted to push a little bit before we talk about Palestine and Gaza today, if that's okay. I wanted, when I first came across your work and when we met, you had been working on the dirty wars, and I'm curious about, and as I recall it, the idea was to you're coming from the US as an American investigative reporter, but you're actually trying to figure out, okay, when we hear about the drones or you hear about Obama saying something, or I'm not doing it, or I'm withdrawing from the Middle East or something, and you're actually literally going to, I remember that in your movie, it was very powerful. And you're actually going to visit this person and see these people's family and figure out, okay, what is this victim? What are they doing? So how difficult was it? How difficult is it, let's say, for a journalist like yourself to say, you know what, I'm going to go to Yemen or I'm going to go to Somalia? And how do you go about doing that? And in contrast, when you meet up or when you see, I'm not even talking about Palestine now, but even then, when you kind of link up with other journalists, more mainstream people that don't want to do what you're describing, what is your relationship with them? Is it just, well, we're all journalists, is it kind of colleagues and journalists and we're all buddies, or is there a rivalry? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, to the second part of your question is going to be more fun to discuss, but to the first part of your question, we were being told that that the Obama administration had essentially invented a new way of waging war in the post 9/11 world by essentially what happened. I don't know how well people are, how familiar people are with this story, but it does require a bit of historical context that I think is valuable. When you get the Democratic or Republican nomination for president in the United States, you then are entitled to an almost entirely full access security briefing. There was a scandal when Trump received this briefing after he had secured the Republican nomination in 2016, because he started then blurting out things that he had been told in a highly classified all access briefing. But what I heard from people who were close to Obama at the time was that when Obama secured the Democratic nomination for president and the CIA and other US intelligence agencies briefed him in the federal building in Chicago, which is where Obama's headquarters was, that it scared the living life out of Obama. And I think that's the intent of those briefings, that these agencies want to ensure that their fiefdoms are going to be protected, that no president is going to try to shatter the CIA into a million pieces, as Kennedy, supposedly said he wanted to do about the agency. And so part of their job is to make sure that incoming presidents are scared and realize that they need those agencies. And I think it was a big part of why you then saw Obama give his notorious statement that on the question of CIA torturers being held accountable, we have to look forward, not backwards, that he was concerned about very early on making enemies among the people that he, I think, was effectively convinced he needed. And, for a variety of reasons, Obama bought into the idea presented by the CIA and the elite Joint Special Operations Command of the United States military, which includes the much hailed SEAL Team 6 and Delta Force and the 75th Rangers. They essentially sold them on an idea, hey, we can still hit these targets. We can take down terror networks like Al-Qaeda and others and confront people that might want to engage in 9/11 style attacks again inside the United States, but we can do it in a smarter way. Just let the dogs off the leash. And the dogs were the CIA paramilitaries and the Joint Special Operations Command. And by the way, we now have these drones that Bush has been using in a weaponized capacity, but let's expand the use of them and just really go after all of these organizations in the hinterlands of Pakistan and Afghanistan, and let's expand it to Yemen and Somalia. And so while this starts occurring and expanding, I set off on a mission to try to go to these places that were at the heart of Obama's emerging war without declaring war policy. And I wanted to go to the areas that were being bombed and see and listen to people on the ground there. And that requires making arrangements, for instance, to go into territory held by al-Shabaab in Somalia. We crossed over the first time we went into Somalia. We had to pay a series of bribes in Kenya in order to get down to southern Somalia, and then we were able to cross over, and we actually met up with several warlords who had been on the CIA payroll. And when I was in Somalia, this is why it's so important. You have to go places. While I was there, I uncovered that the CIA under Obama was engaged in a backdoor continuation of the Extraordinary Rendition Program, which was the CIA's kidnap and torture program used widely in the aftermath of 9/11 to ship prisoners to black sites and ultimately to Guantanamo. But that Obama, despite denying that they were engaged in any rendition and had shut the program down, were using other countries to transfer prisoners to Somalia, and then CIA personnel would be present for the interrogations, but technically not leading them. So I discovered a facility in Mogadishu at the airport that was being used. And this relates to the second part of your question, about other journalists. When I went to the CIA then, at the time I was the national security correspondent for The Nation magazine, and we went to the CIA to get comment from them on my story. And what happened is that they then turned around and they went to a quote unquote journalist from CNN named Barbara Starr. She recently retired, but she was CNN's longtime Pentagon correspondent. And some of us in the kind of adversarial press used to say that she was a dual-hatted employee, that she was both a reporter for CNN and a spokesperson for the Pentagon. But they then fed a sanitized version of this to make it sound like the US is just cooperating with Somali intelligence agencies in trying to fight terror in East Africa. And what they were trying to do was take all of the steam out of the story that we were about to drop. And this has happened to me numerous times. One other example, when Obama was president, I had obtained the 180-plus page government. This is a highly classified document. It was the U.S. government's rule book for how to place people on the terrorism watch list. And we obtained a number of other classified documents about the watch listing process, which basically can start from your name just being in someone else's phone, or you being in proximity to a SIM card of an individual who is on the terrorism watch list. And you can then be sent down a matrix that ultimately can result in you being given a terrorism identification number that could mark you for death as part of the US government's extrajudicial process of sentencing people to death in secret by drone strike. And so right as we were about to publish this, we go to the Obama administration for comment. They then do a backdoor thing with the Associated Press and try to put out a sanitized version of this to spin it, in real time. And when I was at The Nation, we didn't do anything publicly going after Barbara Starr and CNN. But when I was at The Intercept then, we immediately then started calling other journalists that, were allies of ours and telling them, hey, look, this is what the Obama administration is doing right now. And a bunch of stories were reported, on that attempt by the Obama White House to use other news organizations to try to undermine hard-hitting reporting that is going to either embarrass or expose misdeeds or a very dangerous anti-democratic program that was being run by the most transparent administration in history, Mr. Constitutional Law Professor, Barack Obama. So, I have a bunch of stories like that, but I don't chum around with there's those whole cliques of journalists, and you see them when you travel, and they all are kind of buddy-buddy and they hang out together. I'm not part of those circles. I also remember once when we were with colleagues in Afghanistan and we were going to go and meet some Western journalists in a restaurant, and we get to the restaurant and the security guys outside, this was in Kabul, they're like, no, you can't bring Afghans in here. And I'm like, what are you talking about? You can't, this is their country. I'm a visitor here. And they're like, yeah, for security, we don't allow Afghans in the restaurant. And I'm like, okay, well, then I'm not coming in the restaurant. But the restaurant was filled with other, Western parachute journalist reporters who, come in to tell their story. And, I think also that you can tell a lot about people by how they treat the local journalists and media workers, that they work with. And a lot of them don't treat them well, and they don't credit them for the work that they're doing. And, I'm not part of the cool kids club when it comes to that stuff. And, I've been criticized by colleagues because I traveled in areas that were controlled by Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. I went into Taliban strongholds and interviewed, members of the Taliban. I talked to people that my own government says are terrorists, because I think that that's the job of a journalist. Our job is not to be stenographers for the powerful. Our job is not just to interview the people that they tell us are the good guys. Our job is also to go and in fact, I would say one of our most important jobs is to fact check those grand assertions about who it is that we're fighting. And it's something that so few journalists are doing today when they characterize the war against Gaza. It's why I wrote a piece months ago saying that this is not a war against Hamas, because it's not. It's not a war against Hamas. And I think we should stop pretending that Caesar always gets his word. Sometimes the truth is just true, and it's not about objectivity. Accuracy is the most important component of journalism. Objectivity is often a phrase wielded by the powerful to try to say, you must treat our narrative, no matter how fallacious or grand in its lies it's filled with. You must treat that as actually the serious version of events, and everything else is just a minor dissent. No, you can state what the official position is, but if you know that the truth is true, you have an obligation to state the truth.
Yeah, Jeremy, thank you for that. I mean, I completely agree with you. It sounds like academia, actually, in many different ways. There's the establishment, and then there are those who speak in a different register. So my question is, following up on this point, I agree, everything you said is so evocative and powerful. But when it comes to the Middle East, the question we have, there's a couple of questions we have. One is, of course, on the whole question of how it is that those talking points that you referred to, for example, the Israel-Hamas war, the New York Times banner headline, that phrase, or the Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health, are these sort of, so the one question we have is, are these, and to your knowledge, I know you don't work in the New York Times, so you work independently, but to the best of your knowledge, are these sort of editorial decisions that get made and that get passed down, or is it that the establishment journalists, those who want to be part of the powerful, those who want to be chummy with to get inside access, they just go along with these things, knowing that these are fraudulent or that these are propagandistic? So that's one question. And then the bigger question is, in your coverage of the Middle East, what always shocks Seti and Karim and me is that we've always felt that the coverage of the Middle East is so blatantly absurd and racist, especially when you know anything about the Middle East. Palestine especially is the most egregious of places, although you mentioned, of course, the sanctions on Iraq and the horror of Iraq and Yemen and so on. And is it different? Is the Middle East coverage different in the way that it's in sort of the mischievousness? Is it different than the way, for example, Indonesia was covered, or Latin America was covered, or other parts, or Somalia, or other parts that you've covered? Is it actually fundamentally, are we talking about the same system that just reproduces itself in different ways, or is our sense is that the Middle East and Palestine is the most awful form of coverage, the most racist and dehumanizing form of coverage? So maybe you could speak to these points.
I mean, these are you raised a number of really, really rich questions and issues there. And I with the disclaimer that I don't work in in big corporate media. I've written for the New York Times in the editorial op-ed section, but never never as a reporter. And I should also say, I have friends that work at the New York Times. I think the New York Times has some really good journalists, and the New York Times is not a monolith in terms of the people that make it up. But directly to answer your question, it's a policy. There are very strict policies about phrases that can and cannot be used. This is true at the Associated Press. This is true at the New York Times. This is true at CNN. And over the years, the New York Times has shifted its policies depending on who the editor is. But I think that in general, you could say that the New York Times coverage of Israel, particularly its headlines, the way that headlines are phrased, and the almost systematic omission of Israel as the perpetrator of killings of people. This is not an accident, and it's not the individual print reporters that are making those decisions. Generally, it's a top-down editorial decision. And this is not just the New York Times, it's across the board at these news organizations. We recently published a piece at the Intercept that showed, by my colleague Daniel Boguslaw, that showed that CNN has a rule that all mentions of Israel or Palestine or the Israel-Palestine conflict made by any of its journalists, not just its journalists based in Israel or Palestine, but any journalism that deals in any way with Israel and Palestine must be routed through their bureau in Israel, which is subject to censorship by the Israeli government. Just to clarify what I mean for people here, any journalism that CNN is doing, let's say it's a correspondent in Chicago who happens to be writing something that deals in some way with the Israel-Palestine conflict, their report must be routed through CNN's offices in Jerusalem, where it will be subjected to Israeli censorship. Now, CNN says, "Oh, there hasn't been cases where it's been censored." Okay, they can say that, but why is that the case? Why would you're operating in a country with the First Amendment, with free speech, you're an American news organization, and you have somebody writing about something from Chicago, Illinois, you're going to route this through Jerusalem, where you know it's going to be subjected to censorship review by a military force that is currently waging a war of annihilation against, overwhelmingly against a civilian population. I hear from
why would they allow that, Jeremy? So why would that even? Can you explain? I mean, it seems nonsensical.
The rationale for it is that this is such a sensitive area and that CNN is so important that it has to make sure that it gets everything right, that it has to be handled by the true experts, and those are the people that operate CNN's Jerusalem bureau. That's the official line on it, is that it's because of the extraordinary sensitivity of it that it has to be routed through the Jerusalem bureau. And CNN didn't dispute this report at all. They just sort of said, "Oh, come on. I mean, like, we're all adults here. We're not, we're not going to be having our work, censored." And it's been a longstanding policy of CNN that they said. I do think, though, you made another point kind of in passing, but I think it bears mentioning. I think one of the greatest problems right now in big corporate media is so many reporters have just adopted a form of self-censorship. And, and people are groomed to believe, from very early on, particularly in the American and British political context, that criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism, and that you must go way out of your way to be more than fair to Israel. But when Israel makes an allegation about any Palestinian, no matter how insane it sounds, it must be treated with seriousness, and only if it can be disproven by the Palestinian side or by some Palestinians of note are we going to actually treat it as though it should be given equal weight to assertions made by Israel. I think that's pervasive across the board. Now, I will say, and this is not a scientific declaration by me, but I've heard, because the Intercept, in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, it was very clear that the Intercept was staking out a position on the events taking place in the Middle East, that we understood that immediately, that this is going to be a war of annihilation that Netanyahu was going to launch, that his political career was in jeopardy on October 6th, that October 7th represented for him an extraordinary opportunity to save his political career by planting the flag of survival on the corpses of the Palestinians of Gaza, that Joe Biden we had just done a huge series on Joe Biden when he was inaugurated called Empire Politician. And I was the lead reporter on that. And I went through decades of Joe Biden's statements. I read everything Joe Biden has ever said about Israel. I knew from the moment I started watching the Hamas raids into Israel, the world is going to change as a result of this, because you have the perfect storm. You have Biden, who is a half-century committed ideological proponent of the most aggressive Israeli policies. You have Netanyahu, who is backed into a corner politically. His political career was in serious doubt. And so The Intercept, very, very early on, recognized this for what it was. And what happened is you saw in a lot of newsrooms, journalists being told that they needed to tone it down, that they weren't allowed to express opinions on social media, that and certain reporters were taken off the beat. If they happen to be Arab or they happen to be Muslim, you're not going to be able to be objective about this. Meanwhile, some news outlets have former IDF prison guards on their staff as journalists, or they have former spokespeople for the Israeli government on their staff as journalists. But Arab and Muslim journalists were being told privately, sit this one out. You might be too emotional. I heard from colleagues at many major news organizations about the informal pressure that they were under that was meant to come off as concern about them. This is probably very difficult for you to watch, so why don't you cover this other thing? I think that happens a lot. And it was also happening in 2021 during the siege of Gaza. And you've had journalists that have been fired, have been suspended, have been issued warning letters. The Intercept now is independent. We no longer are bankrolled by Pierre Omidyar. I mean, he was a really generous guy, but we're independent, so we're raising our own money. People probably get our fundraising letters all the time. We also are finding that there are donors that are saying, because of the position that we've taken on Gaza, they are not going to give money to the Intercept, and that's fine. That's their right. That's not going to shift what we do at all. I think, though, that in general, you've hit the nail on the head when you talk about the way that Palestinians are reported on in the American media. I don't think that there is any direct comparison. I think that over the last 75 years, the way that the story of the Palestinians has been chronicled by major American, probably even Western in general, media outlets has been a dehumanization effort. It has been fairy tale narrative about the righteousness of Israel's crusade. And it's been backed up by the full force of the American empire. You can't underestimate the relationship between political and media power in the United States. And I think that the tone has been set in the way that the United States has carved out Israel as the kind of supreme priority of American foreign policy and recipient of American weapons. And no American politician has been a more dedicated servant of that mission than Joe Biden. And that's just a fact. It's just a fact.
Jeremy, that's amazing and obviously disturbing in various kinds of ways. We'll come back to Gaza in a second, but I just want to cycle back to something you said in response to, I think it was to Osama's question, which has to do, and this interests me as somebody who teaches English literature, who is interested in language. The question of language, I mean, some of it clearly is, as you're saying, a matter of, we will construct sentences or headlines in this way and not that way, and so forth. So it's obviously there's a sort of consciousness to it. But I'm wondering about those, the certain terms, for example. One of the most insidious ones, as far as I'm concerned, is the use of the term Israeli Arab to refer to Palestinians who are citizens of the state, right? Because it includes the fact that they are actually Palestinian. It disappears them in a certain kind of way, and I've had arguments with news organizations for whom I've written about exactly that particular phrase. So in an instance like that, is it just, well, we're going to use it because we've always used it in a way? Is it just, well, let's not, if it ain't broke, don't fix it? Or is it, if we change it, that's going to get us in trouble? Like how in other words, how much of these things is sort of conventional wisdom? This is the way we've always done it. So therefore it's ingrained in us, as opposed to consciously, oh boy, if we fix this, there's going to be hell to pay about this kind of thing. What's your sense of the kind of balance there?
No, these are policies. I mean, I'll just give you an example. The Intercept itself, we have created our own internal policy guide for how we refer to any number of things, and we studied policy guides from other news outlets too when we were crafting this, and it could be something as kind of unimportant as what spelling of Al Qaeda do we use. Or do we put an H on the end of Fallujah, or do we leave it with an A? And we'll often look at like, what does the Associated Press do? What does Reuters do? What have major authors who have written on these subjects? What do they say? So we've had staffers who've done real research because we want to come up with something that makes sense. And when it comes to how we characterize people from different nations or part of different struggles, sometimes we don't have a direct policy on it, but we often then, I'm just saying at the Intercept, we'll have a discussion then. What do we think is the most accurate way to present this? Is there a narrative here? Are people being framed? Are we just adopting a way of talking about a group of people or a rebellion somewhere because that's how the New York Times and Washington Post are reporting on it? Let's dig a little deeper. Let's see if we agree with their analysis on that. So we do this all the time. And in doing that research and kind of looking at that and crafting our own style guides and policies, you learn a lot about other news organizations. Now, I don't know specifically about the phrase Israeli Arab. I read it everywhere also. My guess would be it's a policy. I don't know that for a fact. But in places like the New York Times and Washington Post, occasionally you'll have a reporter who is a major figure that is allowed to break the mold on certain things. And sometimes on the editorial pages, people are allowed to veer away. But there definitely is a default rule book. My guess would be, I've never seen a published copy of the New York Times rule book for phrases on Israel-Palestine. My guess would be there's whole sections about this stuff, and that when people turn in copy, you have an editor somewhere that knows it well, and they're just flipping through it and changing the way that it is. The Gaza-run health ministry thing is really interesting. I mean, I think you gave a great example, the Israeli Arab, and if anyone is watching or listening who works at the New York Times and you have a hold of that style guide, send it to the Makdisi brothers or me, and we'll be happy to publish it or discuss it. But on the issue of Gaza-run health ministry, what I think is interesting about that, or a Hamas-run health ministry, is those are conservative.
Because that just happened. That happened now, right? The thing, like,
yeah, they just started doing this.
It just started doing it out of the blue, basically.
It started becoming, you did have blips on the radar of this in 2021, and the Israelis were really pushing this. It didn't really stick in the way that it did then here, and that now it's become everywhere. And in fact, if you post any, I mean, just today I did a piece that mentioned the latest numbers that are more than 25,000 dead in Gaza, and I noted in my piece that these are conservative numbers, and this is what's so bloody ironic about this obsession harping on, you need to call it the Hamas-run health ministry, is that they actually have a pretty conservative methodology for reporting deaths and injuries. The rules there are that that any dead have to have come through either the hospital system or the mortuary system in Gaza. And this is true also with estimates of wounded. There are other organizations that are, for instance, including thousands of people buried under the rubble in their calculation of the death toll. So, but what is the purpose of insisting on Hamas run in that phrase? The purpose is dehumanization. The purpose is the same as Joe Biden saying, well, I don't trust any of those numbers. These are Hamas numbers. The whole point is part of dehumanization. It's a not so subtle way of co-signing the statements made by senior Israeli officials that there aren't actually any innocents in Gaza. And what the estimates were, something like 20,000 Hamas fighters. If Israel has sort of just been blasting away and just mass killing all these Hamas guys, how did 21 soldiers get blown up trying to lay mines to demolish yet another building? Who is fighting the Israelis if so many of these people are actually dead Hamas fighters? The truth is, I think that the Hamas-run health ministry is undercounting the dead. And it's shameful that news organizations continue to harp on this when major international organizations have vetted those numbers and have said that they track with their own independent assessments.
Jeremy, let me, since you're talking about this, and the thing that keeps being recycled when it comes to Biden, for example, the baby beheadings. And once that kind of came out, and then there was denials, and even the Israelis kind of denied it, and it still made its way into his speeches, even recently. And then you get the spokespeople like what's his name, Matt Miller and John Kirby, and these people that come out and do these press conferences or respond to journalists, and you have these journalists that are assembled, and there's always one or two that push, and the rest that seem to just sit there and not push something which everybody understands, and it must be. I mean, obviously I'm not there, but surely everybody in that room understands exactly what's going on. Do people like Kirby and Miller, who sort of look ghoulish, at least to me, and they sound ghoulish, these people know what they're doing, or do they genuinely have they bought their own narrative and their own sense of dehumanization to the extent that they genuinely are not even reading what's in front of them?
I would put those guys in two different. Oh yeah, I would put those two guys. It's two perfect examples. John Kirby, we should say Admiral John Kirby, because he had a long career not just in the U.S. military, but also as one of the top advisors and communications people attached to the Joint Special Operations Command. So he has a very, very long history in U.S. covert operations. He's not just some PR flack that that popped up out of nowhere at the White House. Kirby is he's a very serious character in the American foreign policy establishment and U.S. military establishment for decades. Just important to note. Miller and people like him, these are soulless careerist apparatchiks. And I don't know at what point that guy got rid of his soul or his conscience, but they remind me of like the kind of people that were running around saying that Oxy is a miracle drug. It's going to cure pain and take care of everybody. They all know, like, how can you not, if you have an ability to see and hear, you understand what's going on here. And all of these people at the White House understand this. But people like Miller, I think, are really the embodiment of the banality of evil, whereas Kirby knows what he's doing. And he's choosing to do it. And it's not a careerist thing. He is a believer in these crusades. And there's been articles in the Israeli media talking about how John Kirby has emerged as like the greatest spokesperson for Israel. But no, this guy is in a category unto itself. John Kirby. I mean, he's a guy with a military background who used to spin the lethal operations of the Joint Special Operations Command and covert units of the United States military. He's an extremely trusted guy, not just on communications issues, but on national security issues. And it's quite interesting that Biden has chosen to put him so front and center as like sort of the main spokesperson for this war. I think it shows that Kirby isn't a guy that I think needs to go in there and say, what are we going to say that the president says today? Kirby knows what to say because he's been doing it for so long and he's a believer. Whereas Miller and the other guy that they roll out at the State Department, these are corporate cogs in the imperial machine, and not worth much discussion. But as for those briefings, occasionally Sam Husseini, who runs the Institute for Public Accuracy in Washington D.C., will go and ask really legitimate questions. They basically boxed him out. His hand can be up for hours, and they are not going to call on him anymore because he committed the crime of actually asking about the propaganda that was being repeated by the United States that originated in Israel about a number of about the hospital Al-Shifa, about other now disproven claims that Israel was making. He's now persona non grata. You do have Matt Lee from the Associated Press, Saeed Erekat, that are there. They get called on. They raise really good questions. Most Americans don't see those press briefings. We're in the loop because we're all paying attention like hawks to these issues. most people aren't paying attention in this way. And so they don't see those kinds of confrontations. What they see is the Biden administration messaging, we're doing everything we can to protect the civilians. Oh, bad, evil Bibi, he's really going too far right now. Boy, Biden's so upset with him. And meanwhile, they're circumventing Congress. They're giving more tank munitions. They're doing everything. They're trying to get them exonerated from the genocide charges at the International Court of Justice. All stuff you guys know. But there's two categories: true believers and corporate apparatchiks that are cogs. And this administration has both of them.
But Jeremy, just to follow up, you named 3 reporters, all of whom are Arab Americans, as far as I know. Anyone else? Not that you need to name, but is that a coincidence that you were able to name the 3 that were trying, even though nobody except for people really following this, their voices don't go out. Sam Hussein is one of them, of course, but I mean, what about the others? And the other, because I'm interested, because you mentioned a lot, and it makes perfect sense that when you were talking to Sadi before that, or responding to him, you were saying, okay, the editorially, their policy decisions, their editorial decisions. But what about the individual journalist? And maybe not the lowest level one, but the one, there's some journalists that are fairly well known and maybe don't need to worry about that they're going to be fired or something. Surely they're purely at the journalistic integrity would compel them to push, or if they see Sam Hussein or someone like this saying something, to kind of join forces. So it's not, here's the Arab American guy kind of talking, and we're just going to let him talk and make us feel less guilty. Does that come about or no?
Yeah. Well, also, I mean, just to add to that too, one of the most skillful dismantlings of an Israeli government spokesperson occurred on the airwaves of MSNBC in the United States when Mark Regev was interrogated by Mehdi Hassan. And not long after that interview, in which Mehdi Hassan basically destroyed Regev, we learned that Mehdi was losing his show and very clearly was being demoted in an effort to push him out. I don't have any inside. Mehdi is a friend of mine, but I don't have any inside information as to what happened. But my assessment of it is that Mehdi was being retaliated against because of his positions on this war, which I think were. I don't think Mehdi is some flaming radical. I think what he was doing was just amounted to basic journalism, and his crime appears to have been doing aggressive journalism about Palestine while being Muslim yourself. And having said that, I've been shocked at how. Maybe I'll get some heat for this. I've been shocked at how good some of the interviews that I've watched on Sky News in the UK are of Israeli officials. Now, a lot of the time, Sky News is just fawning over the Israelis. But there have been some really good confrontations of Israeli officials, including by white journalists. But you don't see it that often in the United States. And even adversarial interviews that are done are still done within the fence perimeter of acceptable dialogue among the elites. You don't see, a taking off of the gloves the way you do when politicians in the United States are interviewed at times. With Israeli officials are still treated with immense deference by the vast majority of American journalists, American outlets. I don't know. I don't know if there's a scientific answer to it. I do think that it's, there are journalists that do this kind of questioning. We just haven't, we don't see it happen on that daily basis where it matters. And I do think, unfortunately, a lot of the most epic confrontations of Israeli officials in American media have been by Arab or Muslim journalists.
Well, I guess it's not unfortunate. I mean, that's just the reality, and also by people such as yourself, Jeremy. But the question I have, there's this question that Sadi wanted to ask about the stories that appear in the Israeli. Sadi, maybe you want to ask this after my question about the Israeli media versus.
Then don't ask it for me.
I'm not asking for you, but the question I want to ask Jeremy is, what is the New York Times important, Jeremy? I mean, in other words, what I don't understand is that, we're talking about a generation shift. Our students don't necessarily read the New York Times anymore. So is the New York Times important, or is it sort of, is it social media? Is it the Intercept and all these other there's a million, as you said, journalists in Gaza who often are totally unknown, but they have sort of TikTok accounts and they have their Instagram accounts and so on. And they're able to get the message out in a way that that when we were in, coming in the 1980s and 1990s in this country, it was virtually impossible to get any kind of represent. I mean, one or two people, but that was it. And so is the New York Times relevant? Rephrasing it, in what way is the New York Times relevant today? Or the establishment journalist?
Yeah, I mean, I think as an institution, first of all, I think all of us need to learn how to read the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, Washington Post, major elite publications, because they can offer a goldmine of information about how the powerful think and operate. But you have to view yourself as a serious student of the agendas being promoted by these news organizations. I would say that it would be a huge loss if we didn't have entities like the New York Times in this sense. The powerful like to talk to other powerful people. The elites like to move in elite circles. In order to fight the sort of systematic injustices, in order to expose the unjust nature of American war policy or corruption, there has to be an ability to catch a glimpse into the thought processes and actions behind the scenes of the powerful. The mistake I think you could make is by believing that just because it's printed in the New York Times, it's true or represents accurately the full picture. I think that the New York Times, at its best, does very good investigative journalism, but on a sort of daily basis, a lot of what it's doing is interpreting the squabbles among the powerful, or it's almost like an extremely advanced third-dimensional chess tabloid for the ultra powerful in the world. And I think that I think it would be problematic if such institutions didn't exist, only because it would allow the powerful to sort of fly above it all. And I think that there is a value to it, but you have to study how to read the New York Times, as I'm sure all of you have. I'm struggling with how to exactly say this because I'm walking a thin line. It's not that I think that these institutions are like worth saving. It's that I'm being a realist about it. The world that we live in is the world that we live in. The powerful nations are the powerful nations, and the powerful people are the powerful people. And powerful news organizations have an access that people like myself will never have. And so I think it's important to have the ability to have some sense of the process being implemented by the powerful. And that's what I think is the most valuable part of the New York Times in understanding the nature of power.
Is it worth?
It's a clumsy answer, but that's my...
No. But what about social media? That's the other question. But then is it worth making compromises to if you understand how the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal operate, I mean, there are a lot of people who will say, okay, well, then I'll self-censor to get myself in, to give at least a somewhat more nuanced message than is standard then. But then it becomes
I don't like when
difficult.
people do that. I think it's really, I don't think there's ever a justification for checking your conscience at the door. I think a lot of people trick themselves or fool themselves into believing that trade-off is worth it. And I think it very seldom is. I'll give you one example. There was, when I was investigating Blackwater, there were a couple of times when I was given really sensitive information about the company that I knew would rock the powerful inside that company, but not if I printed it in the Nation. And I didn't go to the New York Times and say, hey, I'll write a watered down version of my investigations of Blackwater so that I can get this nugget into it. Instead, I went to journalists that I respected at the New York Times, and I made deals with them for that. I gave them my reporting and asked for no credit, but I did insist on phrasing, how they were going to phrase it in the article. And it was a really interesting negotiation I had with a couple of very famous New York Times journalists who were covering Blackwater. And in the end, I was able to achieve what I tried to do. And I think it was smart. I think I was able to get some factual information printed in the New York Times that if it first appeared in the Nation wouldn't have been taken seriously. And it did result in congressional inquiry. So I think it's a dance with the devil in some ways, but no, I don't think that anyone should ever say, well, I'm going to say this a different way because I hope that the New York Times will, allow me to step on the stage for a few minutes to make to make one of my 10 points. I think that's a really dubious morality at play and should be avoided. My 2 cents.
Jeremy, that's yeah. Go ahead.
Just wanted to follow up, because I know you're gonna ask the other one, but just one last follow up on this. Do you not think this is a generational issue? So that
It's definitely a generational issue.
Yeah, younger people are not necessarily going to be. My daughters are not reading the New York Times. They're looking at the, all the social media to get those.
I went on something called Twitch TV the other day. I was on with this guy. He's kind of a hilarious guy, Hassan Piker, Hassan the Hun. And I ended up being on with him for 2 hours. And it was so remarkable how many messages I got from like really young people that are on these feeds all the time. But what's interesting, and I think you guys are professors, teachers, and anyone who's interacting with younger people today, and also Rashid Khalidi told me this the other day when I was talking to him, that he sees it among his students that their minds are not contaminated by the kind of monopolistic media culture that everyone on this call right now, we all grew up under it, where you had your NPR if you were in the US, you had local television news, you had maybe your local paper. And then there were the New York Times, maybe the Washington Post, but like you had a small media environment to choose from. And so many young people, look at the paradigm that has been shattered on Israel-Palestine right now. Look at how many young people know something more than just a few things about what the Nakba was. How many people are pushing back against this attempt to deploy allegations of anti-Semitism against anyone who criticizes Israeli policy? There are some monumental shifts taking place that I think people who are around college-age students right now are probably seeing more than the rest of the broader public, that because of social media, because of peer-to-peer education that's happening, you have an environment where great information can spread. Great history can be learned, absorbed, taught on these platforms, but also bad information can be spread. There isn't any, no one is sort of at the helm of these things. And it's the Wild West in so many ways. But I think it's a net good that the grip on dissemination of information, the monopolistic grip, has been shattered. The challenge now, though, is to find ways to ensure that people are absorbing accurate information, or are being are not being misled down a dangerous line. I don't think that the answer is any government getting involved with this. I'm talking about us as individuals, you guys as teachers, me as myself as a journalist. I think part of it is finding what is great about how so many young people are producing and absorbing media, and trying to share ways that we've learned to be responsible or ethical. Getting your facts right, that has to be a priority of anyone who considers themselves a responsible citizen, that pursuit of knowledge. But no, on net, I think it's really great. And I think a lot of dangerous rules about the dialogue on Israel-Palestine are just getting obliterated because young people aren't going to be bullied by it. And it's not just young people, it's all of us, I think, are realizing, unfortunately, and tragically, it has taken more than 25,000 Palestinian dead, and we should never forget that they should be at the center of all these discussions, that the people of Gaza are in a killing cage right now, being massacred with American weapons by a genocidal regime, headed by a man whose political career was in tatters until this war began. But the paradigms are being shattered, the rules are being rewritten, and the resilience that has been forced upon the Palestinian people is educating all of us and educating the world. And I think of Rafid al-Arir and how he, before he was assassinated by Israel, spent so much of his time online patiently trying to educate people. not just doing it in the classroom, where he was a much respected and at times feared teacher, according to his students, but also spending endless hours on social media, just trying to educate all of us about what conditions were like in Gaza. And I think his legacy lives through the young people who can now tell their parents what the Nakba was.
Jeremy, there's undoubtedly an incredible generational shift taking place. And part of that has to do with with what we're talking about now, with the transition from more mainstream platforms like the New York Times and CNN and NPR to the less mainstream. And you're right, there's a kind of decentralization of information and news sources and so forth that goes along with the reliance on social media for information, which has good things and bad things about it. But one of the most striking things about what we're witnessing now is the kind of the accessibility of greater information through various social media platforms that the mainstream media don't cover. My brothers know that the question I wanted to ask has to do specifically with the representations of the events of October 7th, which if you look at CNN, NPR, LA Times, New York Times, Guardian, etc., they just repeat that same Israeli mantra about Hamas attacked Israel on a clear blue sky, out of the clear blue sky, and massacred 1,200 Israelis. They used to say 1,400, then they revised it down to 1,200, but that number has stuck. And as I'm sure you know, there are all kinds of reports. Actually, from the very beginning, there were all kinds of reports circulating primarily in the Hebrew press in Israel, but now increasingly in the English language press in Israel as well, that cast severe doubts as to exactly what happened on October 7th and the extent to which the Israelis themselves do what their army specializes in doing, which is indiscriminate fire at basically anything that moves and even things that don't move as well. And it's very clear, for instance, that even when you look back at the footage coming out of October 7th, when you see all those cars with, and you know this from your experience in Iraq and Yemen and other places, the burnt out car with the burnt corpses inside with the penetrated roof, that's the signature of a Hellfire missile. And guess who has those and guess who doesn't have them? Yeah. So it was very clear from the beginning that what we are constantly told by the mainstream press in the West about October 7th, simply there was more to the story than what we were being told. But the interesting thing is that, it was alternative platforms, for example, Electronic Intifada and other sites in the US, began reporting on this immediately based on Israeli reporting and in the Hebrew. And as I said, as those stories proliferate, the mainstream press to this day just look askance. They just they just ignore them. So I'm wondering, okay, we've talked about self-censorship, we've talked about kind of self-indoctrination, we've talked about language, all these kinds of rules, code books and what you can and cannot say and so forth. But here's a huge story. It's a big story. It's not being told. Is that like what's happening there? How can it be that? Is it that if I, a journalist for the New York Times,
people are afraid.
That's what it is. Like if I start covering this, I'm going to get in trouble, or how exactly does it work?
Well,
you think?
I think there's a combination of things. One is that the first draft of history that was provided on October 7th was provided by the Israeli military and the Israeli government, and by Israeli journalists who are close to the Israeli military. This is where you got, for instance, the now totally proven to be utterly false story that there were 40 beheaded babies. This is where you got the story that there was a pregnant woman whose belly was cut open and the baby was removed from it by Hamas terrorists. This is where you got the statement that there were babies and children hung from a clothesline. I actually have gone through, because I care about the truth, I've gone through and I've read not just Hebrew language Israeli media coverage of the events of October 7th and the subsequent investigations, because there are investigations and there are family members of, there are people that lived through the events of October 7th at the kibbutzes that survived, and there are family members of people who died in the attacks on October 7th, who are very serious in their confrontation of the Israeli state about lies being told about October 7th. And what I wanted to say is that if you look at the most current numbers provided by the Israeli Social Security Agency, the official death toll of October 7th is 1,139 people. And of those, 695 have been identified by Israel as Israeli civilians. 695 people. 373 were members of the military or other security forces. These are not numbers from Electronic Intifada. These are numbers from the Israeli government. And then you take that and you look at the events at Kibbutz Be'eri on October 7th. And you have at least 2 civilian eyewitnesses who had been taken hostage by Hamas or other militants that had operated on the kibbutz that day, who described a scenario where the Israeli military fired shells at a house that these witnesses, one in particular, Porat is her last name, managed to escape, and she was standing there. Yasmin Porat. So she's standing there watching this happen and watches the Israelis shell the house and believes that the Israelis who were killed inside of it were killed as a result of this Israeli military action. And in fact, the Brigadier General Barak Hiram, who has publicly admitted, he was the Israeli commander that day, has publicly admitted that he gave the order to fire on the house, even at the cost of civilian casualties. Now, this is just one incident where we happen to have brave individuals who have, stood up and talked about what might have happened that day. And I've watched hours of raw footage also from October 7th because I care about the truth. And if you had Mark Regev, the Israeli government spokesperson, saying that they reduced the death toll from 1,400 to 1,200 because 200 of the corpses, that were burned so badly, and it took a while to do the forensics, that they subsequently were identified as Hamas terrorists. Who burned them? Who burned the bodies? How many other bodies were burned in those Israeli operations? So, I've seen video of gunmen blatantly shooting civilians, murdering people in cars, shooting into homes. I don't doubt that there were war crimes committed that day. I think that there is a real debate to be had about the Hamas attack on the Israeli military installations. And there's a broader context to this that has to do with international laws and conventions surrounding the rights of occupied people and the rights of the occupiers. And I think that this would make for a very interesting legal case to question the events of October 7th. I think it should all be litigated and examined. But the fact of the matter is we actually know very little that is factually documented about the specific events of October 7th. We know that civilians were killed. We know that Palestinians killed some civilians. We don't know how many they killed. We know that the Israeli forces killed some civilians. We don't know how many that they killed.
Yeah, but Jeremy, my question is I mean, I totally take your point there,
I'm just trying to state the facts. I don't doubt for one second that there were atrocities committed by Palestinians, whether they were Hamas or otherwise. But we don't know. We haven't seen. I don't even think we've seen the tip of the iceberg yet of what happened when Israel responded that day. And this is becoming a very big story now in Israel.
Yeah, but the question is, you can talk about it, we could talk about it, other people could talk about it. It's all over the press in Israel. But why is it that the New York Times won't touch it with a 10-foot pole, or the Post?
Well, the New York Times did a river. I mean, first of all, you had this New York Times story that has been held up by Israel, and then basically was maybe plagiarized is too strong of a word, inspired The Guardian to do a very similar article that dealt with the notion of a more systematic campaign of sexual violence that was unleashed by Hamas on October 7th. And Mondo Weiss and Electronic Intifada in particular did I think very important pieces showing how one of the cases of an Israeli woman that the New York Times claimed had been raped, that her family has quite forcefully not only said that they don't agree with the version of events described in the New York Times, but essentially that they were hoodwinked by journalists of the New York Times into promoting a narrative that they don't actually believe is true. And so when you have both the New York Times and the Guardian doing, these kinds of stories, and then the thing is, the New York Times does this story, the family of the woman in the black dress then pushes back against it very publicly, and then the Guardian repeats that same story without acknowledging that the family had questioned the narrative. That to me is a deeply disturbing series of events, combined then with the fact that the Israeli government has issued an order to Israeli doctors and healthcare providers not to cooperate with the United Nations independent investigation into allegations of rape and sexual violence on October 7th, bears an enormous amount of scrutiny from news organizations. Now, I wouldn't be shocked at all if there was sexual violence that occurred on October 7th, because I've covered enough wars to know that it almost always takes place, that women are incredibly vulnerable when they are in environments of organized mass violence. But facts also matter. And just like Joe Biden shouldn't be running around falsely claiming that he personally saw photos of decapitated babies, news organizations should not take unverified assertions from the Israeli state and just promote those, because this is a deadly serious allegation. Israel has also said that Hamas had a kind of plan that they distributed to their members about raping women. Facts actually matter. This is not to say, oh, that's absolutely false. It's to say that hasn't been proven, and it is journalistically reckless to pretend as though it has.
But then the flip,
isn't it more than that? But just to push this, isn't it more? It's not just unverified. I mean, it seems to me that
it's been debunked.
It's not even debunked, but whatever the Israeli army says and the spokesman, they've been shown to lack credibility over many years, not just in this war.
Oh, they lie. I mean, they lie repeatedly lie, and they should never be given the benefit of the doubt. Yeah,
exactly. So that's the thing. It's not even that, hold on, we haven't verified this. It's these guys lie all the time. We should start with these guys are lying, and then build our case, not even take it as a neutral assertion.
Right. I mean, look, I haven't written on this. I follow these events closely, like you all do. So I haven't done like a journalistic examination of this, but I follow it very closely because, and I may end up writing about it. But this, like the assertion that babies were, decapitated, put in ovens, all the things that they said. There have been so many documentable lies that have been told by the Israeli government and then co-signed by the United States government, that it should just be basic journalistic standards to force the Israelis to prove any assertions before they're printed as fact. I mean, that should just be they should be given no benefit of the doubt whatsoever because of the track record that you and I and others are laying out. But what I'm saying is that I think that just because the Israeli government is a factory of lies and the IDF has systematically lied doesn't mean that we necessarily know what did or didn't happen on October 7th. And so, maybe the nuance of what I was saying wasn't, I didn't do a good enough job of making it clear. But what I'm saying is, if you're going to do a story that has such an incendiary conclusion that you want people to draw, your facts need to be more than in order. Because especially when you're writing for the New York Times, because your recklessness journalistically can take lives. It can contribute to an explicit campaign aimed at dehumanizing the entire population of Gaza. This is also a classic colonial tactic. It's been used against so many resistance movements throughout history, where you portray the people that are the rebels as feral, as monstrous, as subhuman, as bloodthirsty, as rapists, as pillagers, as looters. You never, ever allow any context about who they are, what they represent, or why they are doing what they're doing. And that has been textbook rolled out in this discussion. There is no nuanced discussion at all allowed about why Palestinians might engage in armed resistance. It's just
Jeremy,
savage rapists, looters came in and murdered. First it was 1,500, then 1,400, now 1,200, but actually the number is 695 Israeli civilians.
Civilians. So Jeremy, we agree with you, of course. I mean, absolutely. And the New York Times, in theory, or any mainstream, any journalism of integrity would have to fact check all these things 100 times, especially before they make this. Although we know with the New York Times and weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, we know the legacy of the New York Times and its history. My question, I have one last question I'd like to ask. It's about when the last thing you said about how this is part of a pattern of demonizing sort of non-Western resistance movements, and without us taking a stand as such on any of these resistance movements here. But when I on YouTube, you follow I don't know if you follow or are allowed to follow, for example, the press conferences that Hamas does, like Osama Hamdan in Beirut, in Lebanon.
Oh yeah,
he has a basically.
Oh, no, I follow everything. I follow all of it.
So just out of a basic sense of information, what I've always noticed about those press conferences is that I told this to Sadi the other day, there are dozens and dozens of microphones from dozens and dozens of Arab and let's say third world non-Western sort of news sources. And Sadi said maybe there's a Spanish one or something like this, but there's almost never American. Yeah. There's never any kind of Western or American journalists who seem to be interested in the least bit, not just in terms of basic journalism. What does this party to the conflict actually have to say? And can you explain a little bit about that? Why these? I mean, what about these press conferences? Because they seem to have, again, we're academics. We don't have a. We obviously are very careful about the fact that we don't agree with the ideology of these organizations as such. But in terms of just basic journalistic integrity, why is it that Western journalists are never present to cover like a major sort of news story? I'm just curious.
And Jeremy,
let me add. Let me just add as well that Hamas released its own kind of this large document about what happened on October. So it's there, it's documented, it's there. I mean, you can dispute it, you can do what you want, but it's not even acknowledged as far as I could tell. It's not even said, yeah, these guys have released it, and this is what they say, and this is how it contradicts what the Israelis say. It's completely moved out, completely ignored.
And if I could add to what my brothers are saying, Jeremy, the other in a way, like the bigger way of asking a version of the same, because I was going to ask the question Osama just asked and what Karim just said in response too, but another way of asking the same thing, so you can think about all these things together, is what would it take? Like Osama's putting it partly in terms of what is there an absence of curiosity on the part? Like, do you not want to hear what these people have to say? But it's also, as Karim said, like Hamas published last week or whenever its version of what happened on October 7th. And it said, it's very clear what it says. Or it said, for example, its charter is very clear. I mean, I'm not a fan of Hamas ideology by any means, but nevertheless, I want to know what it's actually saying, So it says very, very clearly, it said it in the pamphlet it released last week, it says it in its charter of 2017, our enemy is not the Jewish people, we're fighting Zionism because they're the ones who colonized our land. So what realignment would it take, or maybe that's not possible, in order for the things the three of us are saying now to enter into the consciousness of the mainstream press?
I was repeatedly attacked during, just to give you a parallel example, when Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was sort of the focus of major American attention because of the drone strikes, because of the attacks on Charlie Hebdo in France, because of the American religious figure Anwar al-Awlaki and the sort of manhunt to kill him that Obama was engaged in. I would regularly interview spokespeople from Al-Qaeda. I was one of the few Western journalists that also my friend and colleague Iona Craig, who's a great independent journalist who's spent many, many years reporting from Yemen. She also would interview members of AQAP. And I would be attacked by corporate journalists as serving as a propagandist for Al-Qaeda because I had the audacity to interview them. I always found those attacks risible because if you're told that these people are the enemy and you're not going to bother to go and check in on them, see what they're about, I mean, this is journalistic malpractice of the most basic form. You know, when this began, when October 7th happened, Al-Aqsa flood was undertaken, and it became clear how significant this was. I immediately made sure that I was able to access the official communications of Hamas, that I would have some ability to communicate with people close to the movement, so that I could check things about what they were saying or their position, because it's basic journalistic responsibility. You know, what I think we're seeing also is that journalists are afraid, and media outlets are afraid of being accused of taking the side of savage terrorists who rape babies, who put living children in ovens in front of their parents and then sit down at their table and eat dinner. You know, the kinds of things that Israel was saying. But this isn't new. This was this way under Obama as well, where news organizations were just printing that the people we're told are terrorists without actually bothering to check the facts. And I think that there is this unstated understanding among most American journalists who work in big corporate media, that when the US government says these are the bad guys, that those are the bad guys. I really think that's what and it's been that way for a long, long time. It's why Saddam was Hitler and Putin is Hitler, and whoever the bad guys are, if you challenge that simple notion, if you go after the big top line of the US government, you're in big trouble. You're going to be accused of being a traitor. You're going to be accused of treason. You're going to be accused of supporting terrorism. And so I don't think it's a directive from the top. Oh, we're not going to go to these Hamas press conferences and state with any seriousness what Hamas's position is. We're going to use Israel's characterization of what Hamas is as sort of representing their position. And you know what? I mean, this is on a more just kind of basic human level. Because I was following Hamas's media channels and Qassam brigades and the Al-Quds Force social media feeds, and then there's sort of secret Telegram channels because they've been systematically taken off of social media, but they're very clever and they find ways to keep posting things. I'm watching all these videos that they put out. I'm listening to Abu Ubaida's statements, the spokesperson for the Qassam brigades. I'm reading their communications every day. And what's quite interesting is that on a Tuesday, Hamas will tell you what they've done. They'll show you a video of it. They'll show them launching a rocket into a window where there's 3 Israeli soldiers, and the kind of now iconic red triangle pops above their heads. They rewind, they show it to you from a different angle. The next day, then the Israeli government will say, "Oh, 3 of our soldiers were killed in this, municipality," and it's clear that Hamas is offering what appears to be a quite accurate description of a variety of military operations that it engages in. My experience with talking to people on the ground in Yemen from Al-Qaeda was that they often were telling the truth when the U.S. government was lying about various people that were killed. The U.S. I think killed the number 2 man in AQAP like 12 or 15 times. And AQAP would say, no, this isn't true. And then when he actually was killed, then they said it. Okay, he was killed. Now, that's not to say that I think Hamas never lies or that Al-Qaeda never lies. But I think that if you look historically at these movements, they tend to put out information that is worth reporting and attributing to them. And often it's pretty accurate. When it comes to tactical battles and other things, it's very interesting. So I would say that they're doing a disservice to their readers and listeners. I knew months ago that Israel was heading for a quagmire in its stated campaign to eliminate Hamas, just on a tactical level, because I was following the videos from Hamas. I was watching how they were able to pop up from tunnel hatches inside of an encampment of Israeli soldiers who were sitting there, smoking cigarettes and hanging out. the Israelis seized, I'm sure you guys all watch this, but one of the most just extraordinary moments of the propaganda war here is Israel finally gets access into a tiny section of tunnel near the Eretz border crossing. And they put out their own, they seize these videos from Hamas videos. And there was a Hamas engineering corps video that they had that was depicting how engineers and construction workers utilized by Hamas had dug out sections of tunnel, and they were using fairly primitive equipment to try to avoid the seismic detectors that Israel has installed. And then there was a video of Mohammed Sinwar, Yahya Sinwar's brother, driving in a vehicle through the tunnels and sort of saying, like, take a right here and then the second left. He's going down through the tunnels. And what it said to me is that this is an extremely sophisticated insurgency that built these tunnels under here, that they did it under the nose and watchful eye of a force that claims it has the most moral military in the world and the greatest intelligence agency in the world. And it actually showed how utterly futile the agenda of Netanyahu, as stated, the military campaign's goal, that it's insanity. And so, I mean, this is a long-winded way of making what I think is actually a simple point. They don't do it because they're afraid of the label that would be affixed to them. They generally view themselves as American patriots, or in this case, dedicated sort to defending Israel. That's just a part of corporate American media, just like it's part of the bipartisan machine in Washington. And in doing so, they're doing a grave disservice to journalism and to their readers or viewers, because people are going to wake up shocked one day when all is said and done, and Hamas is still going to be in existence. And the people of Gaza are still going to be fighting for their basic humanity. And what have you done? You've participated in aiding and abetting a genocidal war waged with American bombs, with the full support of the White House, by an utter rabid ideologue whose entire worldview necessitates exterminating Palestinians to establish his ethno-nationalist paradise. And the media is a big part of it. The propaganda is a crucial part of it. And not interviewing the people that we're told are these savage terrorists akin to the Nazis and ISIS is journalistic malpractice. Basic fact-checking should be done. And that means talking to the people you're told are the enemy.
Jeremy, I know we need to wrap up now, but I wanted to ask, I think you're in Germany now. If, it seems from the outside that Germany, I don't even know how to characterize it. There seems to be a level of hysteria and insanity, which is quite shocking. And so I'm wondering, if you can, what your observations are about how the media is covering this and the way in which things are being done there.
It's a total nightmare. On the issue of Israel and its war against Gaza, hundreds upon hundreds of people have been either arrested, detained, or issued citations based on speech at demonstrations protesting against the Israeli mass killing in Gaza. It's forbidden to use terms that applied to the Third Reich's extermination of 6 million Jews during the Holocaust. You are not allowed to use terms that specifically were used to describe the Third Reich's actions in World War II and the years leading up to World War II. This is against the law. There is a discussion right now in some German states, and others want to make it a policy of the German government that to get residency in Germany, you have to affirm the right of the state of Israel to exist. You have Palestinian and other Arab residents of Germany being detained, investigated, having their reputations destroyed. There was a case where a major German media outlet took a Palestinian who lives in Berlin, a speech that he gave after October 7th, in which he was listing historical Palestinian resistance figures, including Al-Qassam. And they translated it as he was saying we're the descendants of the Qassam brigades in Hamas, instead of referring to the anti-British colonialist resistance figure. They smeared him, basically said that he was a Hamas agent in Germany, and his life has been ruined. You have just this week, there was a Palestinian academic who's affiliated with Berlin who was summoned by the German police for a tweet that basically said that just because you were a victim of the Holocaust doesn't mean you have the right to support or implement another Holocaust. You've had Israeli Jewish people arrested in Israel for holding signs. Israeli Jewish women arrested in Germany for holding signs decrying what they said was genocide in Gaza. So I can go on and on. I've been in touch with civil rights and immigration lawyers here who said they've never seen anything like it. I also obtained a letter. I haven't published anything about this yet, but a letter written by some very prominent German constitutional law experts who have written to the German parliament expressing very serious concerns about the weaponization of these anti-Semitism speech laws to stifle free speech. And also it struck me how you have the far right party, the AfD in Germany, gaining in popularity in the east of the country and even making inroads in the western parts of Germany. And you had huge demonstrations this past week in Germany against the rise of the AfD. And I was struck by seeing seeing people also holding banners up for various political parties in Germany, including the ruling parties right now in Germany that have entirely co-signed and helped to facilitate Israel's war in Gaza. You're having a demonstration, and rightly so, against the rise in popularity of far-right party. And at the same time, you're holding up a banner for a political party that is criminalizing freedom of speech, demanding loyalty of its citizens to a foreign government that is waging a genocidal war, and you are voluntarily choosing to intervene in a proceeding at the International Court of Justice to try to defend the government that is engaged in a mass slaughter of primarily women and children, and laying siege to the point where you have women getting C-sections with no anesthesia, children getting amputations with no anesthesia, hospitals being bombed, schools being bombed, storytellers, academics being murdered, journalists being systematically targeted. It's downright eerie to walk around in Germany and to realize that there are these echoes of what the vibe must have been like in some sectors of this country in the 1930s when people were demonizing Jewish people. And when they will look the other way at the decisions being made by their government. I don't think that is grand hyperbole. I think that we're witnessing a very dangerous moment in Germany right now as well. And, I think on the one hand, you have some hope in the European Union. You have some governments and some members of parliament and lawmakers from Ireland and Spain and elsewhere that are in an unprecedented manner speaking up about this. But Germany in particular, I don't think how you can draw any conclusion other than they are trying to assuage their guilt over World War II by demonizing and supporting the mass killing of Arabs, Palestinians, Muslims. The people of Gaza are being made to be the sacrificial lambs for European, German guilt over their mass extermination of Jews during World War II. I mean, this is a horrifying reality. And the media culture, as much as we could spend hours criticizing American media, I don't think I've ever seen anything like what I've seen the past 110 days in the German media. Where either Palestinians don't exist in the story, or it's just Hamas. It's as though you're reading in major publications here. It's as though the IDF is in full control of some German media outlets and the dissemination of information about what actually is happening on the ground. It's shocking. It's shocking, and it's really disturbing. it's really disturbing. And it's a scary environment for particularly for Arabs who live in Germany right now. It's a particularly frightening environment right now.
Well, Jeremy, thanks so much for this this insight. I mean, it doesn't bode very well for what, for people like you, who do incredible investigative journalism, to see so many people, again, from the outset anyway, so many people who have the opportunity to do their journalistic jobs that are not doing it, and in the face of real fear. I mean, that's clear. So I just want to, maybe we can close this just by saying, I think, you've said this several times. I think, we need to go back, which is to say there's now 25,000, maybe 30,000 Palestinians that have been killed, including so many journalists, Palestinian journalists that have been reporting, that we know have been targeted, assassinated with their families. And, what is it, how do journalists, I mean, I had asked, I think early on, this question of solidarity among journalists. Unless I've missed something, I haven't seen very much, and I don't mean individually, there's some individuals, but sort of collectively, I have not seen very much, protests, solidarity campaigns, I don't know, whatever one does in these kinds of situations. Oh, we want to go and help, we want to help their families, we want to bring them out, we want to amplify their voices. Instead, you find them on TikTok and being, circulated on Twitter and on social media. Especially, that's where their voices come out. Even someone in Jazeera like Wael Dahdouh, who has become this iconic figure, just because he's most well known even among the Arab audiences. Even he has been targeted. His whole family has been killed. I mean, it's impossible I mean, it's simply impossible to understand what they're going through, to doing this incredible reporting, but at the same time understand they are also victims there as Palestinians, they and their families and everybody they love. So I wonder if we can just close with this, because we have to, like, this is incredible.
I've never felt a greater sense of shame being an American journalist that I have felt over these past 110 days as we've watched our Palestinian colleagues get systematically gunned down and their families killed. I was so outraged when Jamal Khashoggi was butchered inside of the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, and I think all of us as journalists were. And it just shocks your soul when a colleague is murdered. But I'm totally against the Russian government holding Evan Gershkovich, in the Wall Street Journal reporter, in prison. And I have, over the course of my almost 30 years in journalism, I've always stood up for journalists, regardless of what outlet they work for, their politics, when they're being targeted, arrested, harassed, killed, put under investigation. I've defended Fox News reporters publicly against attempts to criminalize their journalism, even though I don't like their journalism and don't agree with it. Because to me, it's just a basic principle that you have to have journalistic solidarity. I've never in my life, in my career, seen more cowardly posture from so many of my colleagues. We have over 100 of our colleagues have been killed in Palestine, and you hear almost nothing about it. And I wonder, how would it be 200? Would it be 250? Does it mean now that you have to increase the death toll of Lebanese journalists? How many journalists? What kind of journalists being murdered with American bombs, weapons, political support? What would it take for famous big-time journalists in the United States to spend any fraction of a moment condemning this, demanding it stop, confronting the Israeli government about it? But that the narrative is, well, these aren't really journalists. That's the hush-hush campaign. Well, they're not really journalists. Oh, yeah, what outlets did they actually work for? Oh, well, they show pictures of Wael Dahdouh with Yahya Sinwar. I can show you American journalists sitting there with Saddam Hussein. What does it prove? Other than that journalists are supposed to be in, or Bill Clinton, right? Exactly. I mean, or all kinds of war criminals, right? So all kinds of war criminals, and it's like, but to end on just what I think is a really serious note, and that is that this whisper campaign against our murdered colleagues in Palestine is so disgusting and vile. And I just say shame on the houses of media in our country that pretend that they somehow are standing for a free press while simultaneously standing silent as our colleagues are being murdered. Look at how many journalists were patting themselves on the back for their bravery and asking Donald Trump questions at the White House, writing whole books about the suffering that they endured by asking Donald Trump some questions. These are journalists who are living in an environment where there is one toilet for every 480 Palestinians, who are watching their family members murdered, and they still get up to go to work after reporting on the deaths of their own family members. And journalists from CNN and other outlets are congratulating themselves about how brave they were for asking Donald Trump a question. Democracy dies in the darkness. Isn't that what the Washington Post has on its banner? You know what's dying right now? Journalists who are being killed with American weapons. How about we all stand together and just agree the murder of our colleagues has to stop, and there needs to be accountability. Shireen Abu Akleh, an American citizen who worked for Al Jazeera, was assassinated in the West Bank. And still to this day, the Biden White House has been stifling a true investigation into her killing. She was an American citizen. So, no, I have never seen a lower point when it comes to journalistic solidarity on the part of powerful, prominent American journalists. It is an all-time low. All-time low, all-time killing spree against journalists.
Jeremy, thanks so much for all your work, really, for all your investigative report over the years, now as well, and for being at least a platform where, at a certain level, these voices can come out, and the people that you interview and your own reporting and your colleagues, thank you so much for all that, and thank you for being with us, our guest here on this podcast. Really
Thank you for inviting me into the Makdisi Diwan for this conversation, the digital Diwan. I really appreciate it, and
thank you, Jeremy.
And thanks also for all of your work and your and launching this awesome new podcast.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks very much, Jeremy.
I thought that was powerful. I mean, Jeremy's voice is, for all of us, it's been sort of a voice in the wilderness for many years, in The Nation, and then Democracy Now!, and then obviously the Intercept and Intercepted. That's one of our regular kind of listening, venues, because he says things that other people don't say. He covers the stories on the ground also that many other journalists, too many other journalists, don't cover. And the kinds of things that came up were. It's interesting to see, although he doesn't work for corporate mainstream journalism, he still has access. I mean, he knows how that world works. Obviously, he's in touch with people who do work in that universe. And it's amazing to see the forms of self-censorship that we've talked about, that we've long sort of speculated about, but the forms of linguistic sort of contortion and distortion and so forth. It was pretty amazing to listen to him.
Yeah, I agree. It's amazing. And Jeremy, somebody I'd met, as I mentioned, in Beirut a while ago, and I've been following his investigative reporting because I think there are not too many people that are at least accessible and that have done such good work. And I think the kind of integrity that comes out of his work is very clear just in our discussion about Palestine and the Middle East more generally. I think I found a lot of insight in his kind of basically taking us through the way in which these editorial decisions are made. When we're sitting at the bottom and saying, okay, how could you possibly still be, referring to babies that are, beheaded? Or, I mean, how could that still find its way into Joe Biden's speeches, And so it's sort of taking down, saying that this is very specific editorial lines that come through from the top and filters down. And what I was trying to push him to try to understand more is that, okay, what about that makes sense, alas, but what about these individual journalists who don't seem to resist? They just sort of go along with it, and they
but his answer is, it's there, right? This is, at the end of the day, it's a career, it's livelihood, it's the same sort of pressure that applies to many academics, unfortunately, too.
Yeah, okay, but then so the issues that journalists love to talk about, which is journalistic integrity and we're being objective and just the most basic form. It's a bit like lawyers who then go against the law. Well, I mean, you can't talk about it and with a straight face in any other context. If you, in a case like this, if you don't do it, then you have no credibility in any other form. It doesn't matter. You can be talking about sports or art or whatever. As far as I'm concerned, if you don't have integrity in one situation, you simply can't. You usually don't have integrity. Period. That's how I would understand this. So I found that very interesting. The importance of taking seriously those that you are investigating. So you're not just investigating. So it's not just, well, I know Biden, I know these people, but going down. When in his case, when he was in Yemen and Iraq and he's in Somalia and all these places where he went and interviewed and talked to people that were victims of these policies that people talk about in the press, the Biden policy, the Clinton policy, the Trump policies. Okay. So I think that's really interesting. And the idea, I thought it interesting that when he just was, naming people that were saying, were pushing back on what I call these kind of ghoulish characters like Matt Miller and John, and especially John Kirby. And he, the people he mentioned were Arab Americans or Muslim Americans. And, I think that's maybe says a lot more than.
No, but he also said there were two. He named Sam Husseini and Saeed Arakat, but there was also somebody else who was not an Arab American, at least. There's it's one or two, but the point is it's tiny. It's this one or two or three people who Max Blumenthal, every now and then you see him in the crowd at the State Department trying to ask a question. It's the same thing. This is kind of, oh, here we go again. The troublemaker is asking the question. We're just not going to ask that. We're going to ignore the raised hand, obviously.
Yeah, and so just for me, ultimately, I think the last point he was making, it's the most sober. Ultimately, it's this from a journalist and from somebody whose life has been spent doing investigative journalism, and he's the editor of this big company, the Intercept, and hosts or co-hosts the Intercepted podcast, which again I really recommend everybody to listen to and to read the Intercept if you don't already do that. The idea that this lack of, I think he mentioned that he's never been so ashamed of fellow journalists, at least American or Western journalists, for their incredible lack of solidarity with these Palestinian journalists. Again, but all the others that that are not known to kind of broader audience, but that are not just being reporters, but they're victims, and they are reporting and being targeted and assassinated, them and their entire families, in unprecedented ways. And so even from this there's journalistic solidarity. It's that I found very powerful just from that perspective. And so
very powerful, very moving.
I think that very moving. And I think it says a lot about those few journalists like Jeremy and others who do have that kind of integrity and who will put their name out and will say, yes, in this context, the solidarity always has to be with these kinds of journalists. Yeah. So, and
of course, how could we, the three of us as academics, how could we not reflect on the fact that, all of these university presidents and university professors and entire universities have been obliterated deliberately, methodically, like the one they blew up last week was obviously with those demolition charges and stuff. It wasn't like in the context of crossfire or fighting. It was deliberate and systematic. And yet, as we know, not a single American university, not a single American university president. They were all so quick to issue statements in the wake of October 7th. Not one of them has had anything to say about the genocide that's been going on ever since October 7th. And not one of them, if nothing else, on their peers, their counterparts in Palestine. Not a word, not a peep, nothing. It's shocking, it's shameful, it's degrading. It's unspeakably awful and racist. Fundamentally, is what it comes down to. This is a form of racism we're talking about.
Absolutely. Same is true with the schools and the hospitals and the healthcare facilities. It's systematic across all these sectors, and the lack of outcry in just at that sector level is really is incredible. We should close. I know Osama has left, so he had to go teach. So Sari, we will. Let's wrap up, and we'll have. We're obviously going to continue these conversations
until the next one.
Until the next one, exactly. Take care.
Bye.